to the direction of Arizal Sion and Eretz Yisrael, befitting to give a brief report on that trip. Something which is very pertinent to everyone here, everyone interested in being zechet to get to Arizal Sion. First and foremost, a person has the proper emunah, he would know that if you were asked what is the most important achievement a person can attain in life, the most important, without any exception whatsoever, the answer is definitely to get to Arizal Sion. Nothing is more important in life, because this affects a person's entire past. Entire past means for as many thousands of years as he has been present on this earth. It affects a person's entire future, meaning infinitely in the future. Nothing else can have that deep an effect upon a person's neshama, which is everlasting. Now, therefore, the most important venture, attempt a person is to strive for is to get to the tzin. There is an additional point of information which we want to discuss now in reference to our attempt made. Our meeting, myself and two boys, Bob and Stan, who were with me, together of course with 11 others from Eretz Yisrael and from Canada. Now, this attempt was made to the best of our ability. No one will deny that. There was a lot of expense involved, as is supposed to be in case of a major mitzvah. The Zohar Kodesh says that a mitzvah is great if it is bi'agar shlim. There's a lot of money and expense involved in it. The mitzvah has much greater value. A person should not seek out a mitzvah which is free, which is costless. Mitzvah is important if it costs. That's why the mitzvah of Esrig is one of the most beautiful mitzvahs out, because Jews spend money, they seem to squander a lot of money on that mitzvah. So in this case, then, it was a very expensive trip, and I can testify to the fact that of all the trips ever made to Uman from America, this was the most expensive one yet. In addition, there was a lot of other sacrifices. Other sacrifices were made by all parties involved. Parties meaning a total of 14 people who attempted to get to the Tzin. Getting to the Tzin involves the trip from here, off of Eretz Yisrael, first to Moscow, and then from Moscow a trip to Kiev, which is a few hundred miles, good few hundred miles. It's an overnight trip by train, or an hour and a half by fast jet. And then from Kiev to Uman is the final leg of the journey. It's only about 120 miles, only because that's the shortest leg of the trip, but that is the main one. In this case, we succeeded going from America to Moscow, which means literally traveling to the Arizal Sion and getting approximately 5,000 miles closer than we are in America. We were 5,000 miles closer to Arizal Sion when we were in Moscow. Moscow to Kiev, direct line towards Uman, again a few hundred miles closer. When we got to Kiev, there we were stopped. We could not get further than Kiev for a number of reasons. The result was, we'll come back to this more in detail, but the result was that from Kiev we had to turn around and go back to Moscow and then from there to New York, which would seem to mean, it would appear to most people that this trip was a failure, chas v'shalom. There was no success in getting to the Arizal Sion. What is the difference whether you travel from here to Kennedy Airport and are stopped there, you travel from here to Kiev and are stopped there if you don't get to the Tzin? The answer is there's a vast amount of difference. We once explained, we said this many times, Rabbi Nachman's haftacha, Rabbi Nachman's promise for those who get to the Tzin was, if you get to the Tzin, if you say, the Tzin means to be standing at the grave itself. You say the 10 chapters of Tillim, the Tikuney Zohar, you give tzedakah, and then Rabbi Nachman said, I promise. This was actually a promise with two top witnesses who was there at the time signed to this vow. I will take that person out of Gehenna and will save that person forever afterwards. Out of Gehenna, of course, means not just from Gehenna after he dies. A person living on this earth, walking the streets, could be living in a spiritual Gehenna while alive. That too, Rabbeinu Zal will save that person from. Will elevate that person to a new level in Kedusha and holiness. Now, Rabbeinu Zal also said, we had this case we mentioned many times of a person who was not a follower of Rabbeinu Zal. He was not actually a Rabbeinu Zal's student. He was friendly to Rabbeinu Zal's students, in that he provided them with bread, a simple commodity, necessity of life, but a very cheap one, bread. And one time this baker died, and he apparently had difficulty up in the heavenly court, and his soul came to Rabbeinu Zal, appeared before him, as did many thousands and thousands of others, as it told the story, who came to plead with Rabbeinu Zal to help him in the heavenly court. Rabbeinu Zal inquired of his students what this person had done. They said this person had helped his students by giving them bread at a cheaper price, a lower price, so they can have bread chalas for Shabbos. Rabbeinu Zal said, because you have helped my students, therefore in turn I will help you in your trial before the heavenly tribunal. That's a very vital lesson, because we see that Rabbeinu Zal will help a person who does the slightest thing for his students. Kol shekain, surely so, one who does something for the sake of Rabbeinu Zal himself, one who strives to get to Rabbeinu Zal himself. As was pointed out too, Rabbeinu Zal once said to one of the two witnesses to this vow, to this promise. One of them was known as Rav of Breslov. Rav Zal, the Rav of the city of Breslov, whom Rabbeinu Zal liked very much. Rabbeinu Zal told him that when Mashiach comes, he will bring Mashiach to Rabbeinu Zal, will present Mashiach to Rabbeinu Zal. That's how much he liked him. In addition, he said that when you come to Gan Eden, and I bless you, you will understand the lightest, the simplest statements that I made while on earth. That's how deep the Rabbeinu Zal's statements are. Which means that the Rabbeinu Zal's hasaga, his understanding, his depth, was just about infinite compared to any other mortal. Yet the Rabbeinu Zal himself said, having achieved so much mentally, spiritually, the Rabbeinu Zal himself said that he wishes that he himself could achieve to understand, to evaluate properly the light, the immense heavenly light that emanates from the steps that a person makes in his journey to Rabbeinu Zal, to Rabbeinu Zal Siyum. Steps means every inch, every foot of the way, every mile, every 1,000 miles. This is multiplied. This Rabbeinu Zal wished himself to be able to achieve that point of seeing the great light that comes from the steps of these people who make their journey to Rabbeinu Zal. In that case, then, we surely cannot belittle, chas v'shalom, the value of a person traveling to Rabbeinu Zal Siyum, covering 100 miles, 1,000 miles, 5,000 miles. Especially, too, the Gemara says that if a person attempts to complete a mitzvah, to perform any mitzvah in the Torah, and due to an accident, which is beyond his control, he failed to fulfill that mitzvah, the Gemara says that the Torah itself accepts that person's actions, his efforts, as though kipilo asor, as though he completely fulfilled that mitzvah. So a person tries his best. He bends his every effort, as much as he can do. For example, in this case, going to Rabbeinu Zal Siyum, spending all the money that was necessary, without figuring any limits, going to Moscow, getting to Moscow without getting cold feet, without being filled with fright and fear, because of an incident that occurred there. We came to Moscow. We didn't go through customs as simply as previously. This was a very exceptional case. Not only did they examine the baggage and attempt to confiscate all these foreign that were brought in, they also took one of us in to a special interrogation room That one was one who was accustomed to this interrogation. It was myself. I'd been there before, but never for this period of time. This was done by the head of the secret police of Russia, in that interrogation room for a period of 3 hours, 2.5 hours alone, a very solid, serious grilling, very strong interrogation, with a lot of threats and so on, as usual in those cases. This wasn't an afternoon or an evening spent pleasant conversation, as they call it, conversation. It was not pleasant conversation. This was a very unpleasant ordeal. And after that ordeal, with threats hanging over our heads further, a lot of these threats, we continued on our journey to Kiev. We came to Kiev that night. A heavy snowfall descended upon the city, and it seemed obvious that it would be impossible physically to travel from there to Uman during our stay. Plus, the fact that they themselves said, the Russian authorities said, in no way will they allow permission to travel from Kiev to Uman. This meant that we had reached the final point of our ability. We had used up every last amount of energy or resources that we possessed to get to Uman. The rest was a heavenly move. Heavenly move because we did not control the weather. We did not make it snow. Nor did we control the hearts of the authorities. When the authorities want, they extend a welcome mat. First time we went to Uman, about 12 years ago, we were received with royal honors by the mayor of the city of Uman, by the authorities, and given a most cordial welcome. Now, what made them so bitter now and so warm then? The Torah says, "Lev Melachim b'yad Hashem." The hearts of kings are in the hands of Hashem. Hashem injects a certain feeling of acceptance or rejection on their part. So this was not within our power. This meant that we had used up every ounce of effort possible. We had done as much as we possibly could, which is known as Anshir de Magas, as far as we could physically perform. The rest was a ethereal, a heavenly move, not under our control, and therefore this is what the Torah says: if a person does everything he can, and due to an accident beyond his control, he does not fulfill the mitzvah, the Torah declares it as though he fulfilled the mitzvah completely. Arizal on that statement says that a person should never be satisfied with this statement. Never be happy with the fact that Torah says as though you fulfilled it. You don't accept the as though. You want the actual fulfillment. True. So in that case, we added to all our efforts the desire. We wanted the actual fulfillment. Nobody can deny that. Despite this, our desire was not enough to effect a sort of miracle and get there. Which means, though, we cannot chas v'sholem belittle the statement of the Gemara. The Gemara does say, and the Gemara means the word of Hashem, that if you tried to the best of your ability, you did not succeed, the Torah accepts it as though you did succeed. And of course, Arizal surely will accept that Gemara too. He'll surely accept the efforts of those who tried so hard to get there. If they did not succeed physically, and surely it is as much or much more than the baker did for the students of Arizal. So surely Arizal will accept the act of these 14 who tried so hard to get to the Arizal scene. We are certain that this is a priceless venture. Again, too, if we could not get to the final inch of the Arizal scene, the last bit of land covered, which means right in Kiev itself. So we had to start going back. We then said the Tikuney Zohar as though we were standing by the Arizal scene. Well, let us say, imagining that there was a crowd of 1 million people standing before the Arizal scene, and this covered an area of 100 miles. So we were at the end of that crowd, in the middle of it. We couldn't get that close, and we said the Tikuney Zohar then with the same fervor, the same feeling as though we had gotten there. Again, we say we believe with implicit faith that the trip was a successful one, enough to a degree. In fact, to sort of prove this, every one of the 14 people was asked the same question. Since you did not get to the tzin itself, surely you suffered a shivrei leiv, the sort of a heartbroken feeling. The suffering, the sacrifice, the money that was expended, all this yisurim, all this suffering that you had is worth a lot. The Zohar Kodesh says there's nothing more precious in heaven than yisurim, because a person suffering forgives for sins much more than does Yom Kippur or Teshuva. So all this suffering you had for the sake of the Arizal sin, it cost you a certain X amount of dollars. How much money would you take, would you sell the mitzvah of this Yisurim for? How much would you take for it? And everyone replied with the same answer: I would not take $1 million or any amount. I would not sell that for any amount, just as I would not sell a trip to the Arizal sin if I had succeeded. This then proves definitely that we are happy to say that the trip was a success. But also in that it whetted our appetite to the desire to attempt once more. We will not stop. We'll attempt once more, again and again, to get to the Beit Al-Siyah. And if we get there, we won't stop either. We'll try to get there again and again. And of course, the hope is extended for every single one here, for everyone who wants to get to the Beit Al-Siyah, that he should be successful, she should be successful in achieving this completion of this mission. Because to get to the Beit Al-Siyah is the highest accomplishment one can ever hope for. We should all be zecher to get there with ease, without suffering, without yisurim, to get to the Beit Al-Siyah and fulfill the necessity to receive the Beit Al's haftacha, his vow, that we can truly be considered closely attached to the Beit Al. Now we continue the story of Noson's trip to Eretz Yisrael. And again, we must pause for a second, because just a couple of brief words, the fact that from Kiev to Moscow to Switzerland, so globetrotters, from there, we could not get to the Beit Al-Siyah, and we did get to Tziyah, to Yerushalmi. From there straight to Yerushalmi, and they're carrying a banner of the same names, those in the group, to Yerushalmi, to the Menachem Mendel, to all the holy places in Eretz Yisrael. As is known, Arizal is the closest one to the Beit Al. The Gematria is the same. The Beit Al's name is Arizal. To get to meet on. Ashrei to those who were zecher to get to the Beit Al-Siyah, and of course, by proxy, you did get there by having your name mentioned there in tefillah for you, to the tzin of the Aliyah Kodesh Arizal, and of course to the Miyoras Machpelah, the cave of 4 couples, or the Mechava, the cave of the fathers and mothers of the Jews, the cave of David HaMelech, the Melchi Beis Yehuda, Beis David, and the Kaisel Ma'aravi, and of course, Rabbi Kochav Lev Zal Siyah. Haggadah is mentioned there, Rabbi Kochav Lev Zal, the tzadik, the holiest tzadik of our time, who is, as you know, the official Rebbe of this group. Ashreinu for that, because he is our strongest binding tie to the Beit Al. And then, of course, in the yeshiva itself, the Beit Al's yeshiva, Rabbi Shemelech was made on Shabbos, mentioning all these names too. So we hope that surely this trip was very successful, above all successful in that the tefillah should bring fruit. Everything that each person wants or needs should be fulfilled. Yimalei Hashem, kol mish'ales libeinu l'teva. All our needs should be fulfilled by Hashem in a manner of simcha, sosan v'simcha, shiduchim, zivugim hagunim, panasa b'shefa. And of course, too, to go back just for a moment, if I may, during the trip itself, it wasn't a waste of time, because we did spend time in the hotels in Moscow and Kiev, there learning. We had a very pleasant time on Shabbos. You can call that pleasantly spending Shabbos day with a million davening and learning, and we even had a little shiur. In fact, one of the interesting sidelights of the trip was that we ate, the three of us, well, I mean, Stan and myself, I came to their room, and we had our Shabbos meals there, Friday night, Shabbos morning, and Shabbos Shalashudis, shiurim each time, and I could see that they were very efficient in every respect. In fact, one thing stood out in my memory. At one time, during a meal, Stan went to wash out a glass. He went to the sink in the room to wash a glass. And of course, his very deft, agile fingers were such that he dropped the glass and broke it. And Bobby, standing there, looked at him, and very peeved, and said, "I told you not to mess around in my kitchen." I'm sure his wife will enjoy that one. But it was a truly impressive trip, journey that was memorable. Again, I say it should be repeated with complete success very shortly from now. Now, a trip that is historic, Rav Nosson's trip to Israel. The story we got to was when Rav Nosson got to the city of Odessa, and there he was attempting to get a ship, the journey from Odessa to Istanbul, Turkey, and then the last leg of the journey going from Europe to Asia, to Africa. Now, in Odessa, as we stated the last year, many tried to dissuade Rav Nosson from making this journey. They told him that it was very dangerous. There was a war going on between the Turks and the Greeks at that time. Traveling by boat, by ship on sea, was so perilous that there would be a very slight chance of making the journey successfully without being killed en route. Rav Nosson was disheartened by these talks. He looked for his chassidus, strengthening elsewhere. And he decided that, come what may, he would make this journey, regardless of what perils are, because remember that Arizal made this trip during the wartime too, during the Napoleonic War, the French-Turkish War. And if there is that much of a desire, then certainly Hashem will help that it will be a successful journey. And so he went and he rented a cabin on board a ship. This, of course, was a ship of Goyim, completely Goyish ship. He rented a cabin, stateroom for two people, himself and his colleague, Abud Eliezer. And he waited for the time that he'd be summoned to enter the ship. The ship stayed in port many days before it set sail. While there, he heard about two messengers, two Talmidei Chachamim from the city of Vilna, which means that they were students, followers of the famous Vilna Gaon. It means, of course, too, they were called Misnegdim. They were opposed to Chassidut. But these two were going to Eretz Yisrael to raise money. He wanted to speak to them to sort of receive some encouragement about going to Eretz Yisrael. He knew they would make the journey. So he visited them, and a very strong debate ensued. Very serious argument. The discussion led to the topic Emunas Chachamim, Emunas Tzadikim. They have Emunah and Tzadik Emes. And this is I'll argue with them, and their contention was, just as today, how do you define a misnagid? Misnagid is meis neged, one who is dead, who has no life, spiritual life, neged, against what? Against Chassidim, against something which is life. Chassid is chas, b'matri chayim, life. Your dalad stands for David HaMelech, Chayim Kayim. These misnagdim are against anything which is true, emes. And what is the actual difference? The difference is emunas tzadikim. They do not possess the faith that Chassidim have in their Rebbe, no matter who the Rebbe is. At least they have emunah and tzadik. So the Arizal debated this point with them, and it became a very heated argument. He asked them, if you don't believe in tzadik emes, then tell me, how do you define the word emunas chachamim, faith in tzadik? They said, of course, we hate to repeat this statement because it is very prevalent today too. You ever get into one of these controversies, forums between Chassidus and Misnagdim, they said, how can you believe in a person? You have to believe in Hashem. And Chas V'Shalom, of course, that is close to kfira, close to atheism, because the Torah states definitely, again and again, that you must have emunah tzadikim as well as emunah Hashem. The Zohar Kodesh goes into that very strongly. As, for example, in one case, the Zohar Kodesh says that Hashem is the king over the Goyim. He rules over all the nations. So one of the Apikoros once asked this question to one of the Tanoim. It means that Hashem rules over the Goyim. What about the Jews? He doesn't rule over the Jews. They rule over him. How is that possible? And the reply was, it is true. Hashem is king. He rules completely over the Goyim. As far as the tzadikim, of course, Hashem says, I control rain. When I want it rains, when I want it does not rain. And then along came Eliyahu Navi, he said, I will stop the rain. He took over the power of rain. Hashem says, in my hands are the power of life or death. When I put a person to death, he stays dead. And along came Eliyahu Navi, he said, he stays dead until I say he goes back to life. We see that Hashem rules over the Goyim, but there is a tzadik emes who can kaviyachol rule over Hashem. And this is the basic tenet of our faith. A Jew must have faith in the tzadik emes as well as Hashem. You cannot separate the two. Emunah b'Hashem of Moshe Avdei. There must be emunah Hashem and the tzadik emes simultaneously. These true misnagdim tried to actually eject Rav Nosson physically from the room, but the Malachsanya, the landlord, made peace between them. Rav Nosson left and said and wrote, Asherinu, how fortunate we are that at least we have this emunah tzadikim, and how fortunate we are not to have a part of these misnagdim, because here are misnagdim who claim to follow also a tzadik, the Vilna Gaon, and they don't even have emunah in the Vilna Gaon himself. Say that he's not great as a tzadik emes. Of course, again and again, the Nosson writes that a Jew can be a true Jew, true Yisrael, a true Eved Hashem, only if he has emunah in the tzadik emes, only if he's truly mekusha, attached to the tzadik emes. There are many tzadikim v'tiyim. Of course, there we have the problem how to get to the tzadik emes. But until a person reaches the tzadik emes, at least the person should have hiskashus, a tie, and faith in all tzaddikim, till he's enlightened to which one is the tzaddik emes. But if he has faith in all tzaddikim, then surely he's also attached to the tzaddik emes at the same time. There is nothing actually lost then. Ashrei to those who are zecher to go through life and get to the realization of the Arizal as the tzadik emes. Many people have to go through another life again till they finally get to this point. So those who have gotten to that realization should be very careful to hold on to it, because it's very easy to drop. Arizal's words are that this world is a geshet tzad. This world is a very narrow bridge, very narrow. And a person walking along this bridge should easily slip and fall off, as we see the infinite number of casualties in each generation. People who had faith and they dropped, chas v'shalom. Many things is not to have any fear, to be strong, courageous in the face of all the opposition. Because if you go out in the street, in the world, you'll find that the average person, the majority of people, will scoff, will sneer at you for having this kind of emunah. To remain solidly strong, the Menachem says, throughout life, to maintain that courage and that emunah, when Mashiach comes, or if a person passes away first, he will then see immediately in the Elam HaEmes, the world of truth, the true beauty of the truth itself, the tzadik emes. This, Rav Nosson said, was his consolation, having spoken to these Mishalachim from Vilna, how fortunate he was not to be part of them. After Pesach, Rav Nosson came to the port, and he had already gotten this room for two reserved in a certain ship. He had to get to that ship to bring his belongings there, his baggage. So he went along the port, the port where all these ships are docked, and he tried to ask instructions, information, how to get to this ship. But all the sailors there were either Italians or Turks. There was no way to converse with them. So he kept on asking for the captain of that ship. The captain's name was Yaakov Tadvayevich. Apparently some kind of a Russian name. Yaakov Tadvayevich. Rav Nosson writes this in his diary, and because of the fact that every detail of this trip was so important. He asked about this captain, and one of the sailors pointed out the ship to him, and he showed him how to get to that ship. In fact, the sailor led him towards that ship. Well, this was a port. The dock had a lot of ships lined up side by side. In order to get to a certain ship, you had to cross the decks of all these ships to go from one to the other. To go from one ship to the next, you had to travel over a slight bridge, a plank from one ship to the next, or you go up and down. Not all ships were the same height. You had to go through ladders, or even at times to climb a rope up and down. Arizal wasn't an athlete, but he writes that his desire, his fervent desire, the desire was so great that he followed this sailor, this weather-worn sailor, who had apparently years of experience at sea. He followed him as agilely and as expertly as though he'd been a sailor himself all these years. He helped his friend along too, till they got to this ship. When they got there, this was Erev Shabbos Kodesh, and he was shown their cabin. He had a little difficulty with the captain first. We can't go into the details. You can read that yourself in the story. Because of a misunderstanding about the price. Rav Nosson was afraid the captain might ask him for more money than he had, which means he wouldn't be able to travel. He had a lot of aggravation over that. He just writes one point that it turned out okay, just that in trying to negotiate, to deal with this captain, he had very much difficulty with the language. Because he writes that he didn't understand Russian too well himself, though he was brought up in Russia. The captain, too, couldn't speak Russian too well, so they both spoke Russian. And he said this was like two Amanatzim, two illiterates trying to argue about a certain pilpul in Gemara. Well, each one doesn't understand what the second one is saying because they don't understand what they themselves are saying. Well, this was a very unclear type of conversation. And finally he succeeded in getting his room established place for himself. Then he had to go back with a sailor to bring his baggage from the port, the dock, back to the boat. He finally had this accomplished, and this is done before Shabbos Kodesh. Then they set about in their room to make a fire to cook a chicken to cover Shabbos. Rosenfeld writes about how the boat did not leave until after Shabbos. Yet they had to stay on board before Shabbos to be allowed to travel if it would leave on Shabbos. They spent the Shabbos in this cabin, and how they did it with such simcha, it's reminiscent of a room in a Moscow hotel where we spent Shabbos. It was a closed cabin. There they had to cook their own chicken, and they made their own meal. They sang Semitas, they kiddush, they ate the meal. This was done Friday night. They davened the regular Shabbos davening together. Same thing Shabbos morning when they davened, and they read the parasha of the Torah. They ate their Shabbos meal. Then they went out on deck to observe the nature of the workings of a ship, a large ship. Rosenfeld writes they spent a few hours. This is unusual. You must take everything seriously to observe very carefully. Rosenfeld spent a few hours watching the wondrous movements, labor, in setting up the sails of a large ship. There was no motor then. And how the sailors worked so feverishly in getting these sails put up, and how much work is involved, the marvels and wonders of a large ship, how this ship can travel the seas and the oceans. Rosenfeld spoke about it as seeing the wonders of Hashem. In each generation, how there are things done that defy nature. How can a ship dare to set out on an ocean voyage against storms, winds that might take it other than its course. And of course, as is mentioned by Moshe Feinstein, later Talmidim, that Hashem, Nosson himself writes that Hashem conducts the world most wondrously. In each generation, Hashem adds something to the world. We find new inventions, new innovations. This generation is so far ahead of the past generations. Rabbeinu Zal warns about that, not to think at all that we are wiser or more advanced mentally than the past generations. On the contrary, they were much smarter than we are. They did not discover electricity or any other of the inventions we have now, not because they weren't as smart as we were, because the date had not yet been established in heaven. When Hashem wanted that date to come, He would place the knowledge of electricity even in the mind of a dummy like Franklin, whoever it was, because that time had come. So Hashem put it in the minds of a certain individual on earth, and suddenly, lo and behold, he became a genius. He discovered something that's so important. Well, the motor or so other types of innovations that came into being. So this Nosson Zal observed very closely to see the wonders of Hashem, how these wonders are applied in each generation to improve the lot, the standard of living. They spent a few hours there. Afterwards, they davened mincha. They hoped to leave then, but there wasn't a strong enough wind, so they stayed over until after Shabbos. While there, the captain offered Rav Nosson Zal tobacco, smoke. Nosson Zal declined the offer. The captain said to Rav Nosson Zal, very suspiciously, of course, I presume you have a lot of money. And of course, you're Jewish, you're very miserly, you have a lot of money. That's why, because you don't smoke, you try to save on everything if you have a lot of money. Nosson Zal was afraid that he might think they're wealthy, perhaps he might even try to kill them for their money. So he said to this captain, with a very sincere tone of voice, the truth is that we do not smoke, not because we are miserly, we're simply very poor, and we have no means of achieving wealth. This was accepted by the captain, so now he realized they were poor, and he gave them more food than he had intended to at first. They accepted everything with simcha, with happiness. Nosson Zal said he was zeichet to find peace of mind on that ship. On Monday, the ship set sail on Sunday, and the first day, Nosson Zal writes that he was surprised he did not become seasick, because it's normal for a person going for the first time on board a ship to become seasick. The first day he wasn't. He thought he would have mastered this already. But on Monday he became very ill, together with his chaver, and until they weren't able to eat at all. At night, this lasted during the entire day. At night they slept very little, and on Tuesday they felt a little better. They heard the captain and some of the crew playing instruments, and sort of a semi-orchestra there, a band playing instruments, music. And they heard that some of the crew were dancing. These, of course, were all goyim, doing dances, geisha dances on board this ship. Nosson Zal came out together from Minamaza. They watched them dance, and slowly they joined these goyim in the dance. They went into the center of the circle, they danced themselves. The others stopped to watch. When you see the Chassidim dance, it's more spectacular and more intriguing than a hadol any other time, because this is done with spirit. So the Arizal brings lipa nosas raglav. The heart is put into it, and the heart just elevates the feet so that you actually dance on air. The heart carrying the feet. You got to stop to watch Nosson Zal and his partner dancing so well, and two sailors who were drunk jumped into the circle, and they too started to dance. Very happy, very joyous dance. Nosson Zal said that he watched that and said to himself, how wonderful we are, Ashreinu. And here we have them dancing, the Goyim, happy with what? They don't know what happiness means, with what to be happy. We are happy because we're on our way to achieve the greatest possible schus, to get to Eretz Yisrael. So he said, let them dance and we'll dance, each one with different thoughts in mind. Of course, this went on for a while. Arizal thought, too, that it was a bigness, a miracle he had witnessed, where among all Goyim, in those days Goyim were Goyim, like, well, of course, today, too. Today we have the United Nations who are all Goyim. And the Goyim means one who hates or despises a Jew, to an extent. In many cases, it means to the extent where he'd like to get rid of the Jew completely, chas v'sholom. Here then, they had Goyim who were all against the Jews, who looked down at the Jews. Though they themselves, these Goyim, were complete illiterates, were worthless creatures, yet they looked down at Jews. So in the midst of all this whole crew of Goyim, on this that the Nosson and his partner could dance openly, go into such a holy liquid right under the stars of the sky. Nosson wrote about this with great simcha. He was zecher to dance on his ship headed for Istanbul. On Erev Shabbos Kodesh, they reached Istanbul. It was Friday, but they got there too late to leave the ship. They had to stay over Shabbos on board the ship. On Sunday, they entered the city, and they got to an Achsanya, a hotel. They recognized some Jews from Europe, and these Jews spoke to Rav Nosson very, very strict, severe, stern tone of voice, telling him that it was foolish, it was folly to come this far, but there was no way, no possible means of getting to Eretz Yisrael. He should turn around quickly and go back home because it is impossible, in any conditions, to get to Eretz Yisrael. Of course, this caused him a great deal of heartbreak. And he turned away. He went into a corner and he began to pour his heart out. He began to cry before Hashem. And then he felt a little better. He went back, and somehow he met a woman who was traveling from Istanbul to Odessa, going back. A woman, a Jewish woman. And he got into conversation with her somehow, and she said to Rav Nosson, don't listen to these foolish men, because I tell you, just came from Eretz Yisrael. There may be some risk in traveling, but it's nothing. If you want to get to Eretz Yisrael, you certainly can do it. There's no problem whatsoever. If I could do it, you could surely do it. Anybody tries to talk you out of it, just ignore that person completely. I tell you that it definitely could be done. Nosson wrote about this. We just encouraged him very much. Of course, it's noteworthy again and again to note that sometimes a woman has more courage than a man. You find that in case of childbirth, they're better off. But the type of courage in doing a mitzvah, we find often when it comes to mitzvah, a woman has a greater strength of purpose, strength of heart in carrying this out. And here, Nosson felt so dejected, he got to a point that was chas v'sholom close to yish, not actually giving up hope, but close to it. He was very brokenhearted. Here, a woman came along and raised his hopes, raised his spirits to the point that he felt now for certain that nothing could stop him anymore. He would definitely carry out the rest of the journey successfully. His problem, though, now was how to spend the next few weeks in Istanbul before going on the next leg of the journey from Istanbul to either one or two ports, the next stop, either to Alexandria in Egypt or to Beirut in Lebanon. That was the next, either one of those two. He had to decide between these two. Meanwhile, to stay in the city of Istanbul, which was a very strange type of city, as we'll see in the next chapter. It is important to note, though, that this was the same city where Arizal too spent time before his trip to Haifa. We'll continue this in the next shiur. And again, we point out the most important moral of this story. Nosson's words, that the yesod, the foundation of a Jew in life, the foundation of a Jew's future forever, is emunah, is faith. Faith in Hashem, faith in the Torah.
Okay.
We continue the shir, topic of Rabbi Arizal, Rav Nosson's Nesiah trip to Eretz Yisrael. We're up to the part where Rav Nosson finally arrived in Istanbul. He got there Erev Shabbos Kodesh. And he was forced to stay on board the ship until after Shabbos was over. On Sunday, he went into the city, the section of the city called Galita, which is the section, is not the Jewish section. On Monday, the second day, he decided to attempt going to the other part of the city where the Jewish quarter is. Now, there was a very serious problem with finances. Moshe writes that he did not even have half of the necessary expenses to get to Eretz Yisrael, aside from the return trip that he would worry about once he got to Eretz Yisrael. Meanwhile, he needed a large sum of money to purchase the ticket for the next leg of the journey, so he decided to go to the section where the Jewish quarter was. This meant a very short oversea trip by a small boat to get to this part of Istanbul. He decided to take with him the Benazal's Sephonim, the Kutei Manan, other Sephonim which he brought with him to sell in order to subsidize his journey. His partner, his colleague, Rabbi Eliezer, refused to go to that section of the city because he said it is a section filled with Sfaradim, a kind of Sfaradim who make jest of, make fun of, mock the European Jews. It sounds strange, doesn't it? You haven't lived in Brooklyn if you think that's strange. Now, despite this, Rav Nosson insisted that there was no alternative. So they set out to this other section of the city. When they got there, of course, they were dressed in their regular garb, which means the black coats, payas, the regular hats that we see today, with the Chassidus clothing. And the children began to make fun of them, as though, chas v'sholom, they were insane, lunatics, the children. And they kept running after Nosson and Rabbi Eliezer, making fun of him, calling out names after them. Of course, they could not understand the language. It was very difficult to communicate with anyone there, because even if they spoke to a Jew, Nosson writes that the Lashon Kodesh, the Hebrew, was so strange to them, the accent was more of an Arabic type of accent that they could barely understand each other. So they finally spoke to one, and they asked him to help them, to bring them to the Chacham, the rabbi of that city. This person agreed. He brought them to the house of the Chacham Bashi, that's the chief Sephardic rabbi of Istanbul. They came there. Nosson went up himself. And when he came to the room, the anteroom before the rabbi, he found that there was someone there waiting to go into. He went inside finally, and the rabbi looked at him in a very sharp tone, an angry tone, said, "Come back tomorrow." Because he wasn't feeling too well, but Nosson felt the air of antagonism so strong that though he was desperate to make contact with the rabbi, this Chacham, he felt a deep feeling of relief in getting out so quickly. He went downstairs, and he and his chaver sat down. We use the word chaver, of course. Obviously, we believe that this was his Talmud. Nosson writes about him as his chaver. Of course, again, he was certainly his Talmud. We use Nosson's Lashon of chaver, but keep that point in mind. They both sat at the curb, and as people passed by, some of them stopped. They bought a few sforim. Each one who came, they had difficulty, of course, in conversing with him until they sold a few sforim. And one man came along who spoke to him a little more clearly, and he told them he was interested in buying Sforim. They should come to his house, and he would talk to them there. They followed him to his home. Rosenfeld asked him, primarily, the main problem we have is we need a place to sleep, to stay over. So he refused at first. Rosenfeld pleaded with him. Then he finally consented. He agreed to have him sleep there, to accept him as guests. Little did he know what a zechus he had. The zechus was so great that it's written down for centuries, forever afterwards. Like the Gemara says, if Reuven had known how big Moshe Feinstein would write about his saving Yosef HaTzadik, how much more he would have done. Here, this man unknowingly had the Zechiyah, having Rosenfeld in his home as a guest. But he said to the Rosenfeld, the reason that I'm taking you in is only because my wife is not home. Because the Sephardic women are very much against taking inside guests. They're against Achnasas Oichem. And especially, much more so, against Ashkenaz guests. Perished the thought. Because she was not home, he was willing to take Rosenfeld in. He stayed there for a while. Now, that was the only place he could sell these Sforim. Rosenfeld writes that he sold 6 Likutei Marans. This made him very happy. The fact that he was able to spread Arizal's Sforim in so far off a place, Istanbul, among the Turks. Land of the Turks, where a strange breed of Sephardim lived, spread the Arizal's word there, he was overjoyed. Now, he had to commute between these two parts of the city. He became friendly with a number of these Sephardim, the better ones, the more educated ones. One time, he tells about an unusual conversation with them. They began to look up to him, to respect him, as a Talmud Chacham, as a tzadik. And this group of elderly Sephardim once asked him a question. They asked him the usual question that any person, the first question any person would ask of a tzadik. The question was, tell us, when is Mashiach coming? Rosenfeld replied, you expect me to give you the answer? I'll tell you what the Gemara says, what the Zohar Kodesh says. The Zohar Kodesh says, the Gemara to Sanhedrin brings that the libi lepuma legilisi. The Gemara says, la'evodai libi gilisi la'evodai legilisi. Hashem says, the secret of the date of Mashiach's coming, I did not even reveal to myself, to the parts, different parts of myself, only to my heart. I revealed only to my heart. Rosenfeld said, what's meant by Kaviyachol, the heart of Hashem, the Evorim, the other parts? The Evorim refers to the tzadikim. Different parts means the regular tzadikim. Hashem did not reveal the ketz, the time, the schedule of time Mashiach's coming to any of the tzaddikim at all. Revealed it only to his heart. The leiv means the tzaddikim amitiyim, a certain select group of tzaddikim, the highest possible group. And this, of course, means, again, we've gone through this topic before when we learned Daniel, if you recall, with the Gemara. But the Gemara says, Tipach Aruch Zohar, cursed are those who attempt to reveal the time of Mashiach's coming. Cursed, why? Because they know nothing of what they're speaking about. No one knows the time of Mashiach's coming, and the one that does, the tzaddik emes who does have that information, will not reveal it. Just as Hashem says, I will not reveal it to any tzaddikim, except believe me, the tzaddik emes. So therefore, this is a question that cannot be answered. You ask, when is Mashiach coming? I can only say the words of Hashem. I reveal it only to the heart, the tzaddik emes. So, these Sephardim said, we know. We'll tell you who the heart is. Who is the tzaddik emes, for example, who knows of the cakes? They said, we find that Yaakov Avinu, Bikesh, Yaakov Megalis is Kates. He wanted to reveal the Kates, which means that he knew when the Kates was. The Kates means the date of Mashiach's coming. He knew this date. How do we find that he was called the leiv, the heart? Because if you take the letters Yaakov, the Milui, Yud, Ayin, Kuf, Beis. Yud immediately is Yud Vav Dalet. Ayin is Ayin Yud Nun. Kuf is Kuf Vav Pei. And Beis is Beis Yud Tav. The middle letters of those four Miluyim, Yud the middle letter is Vav. Ayin the middle letter is Yud. Kuf middle letter is Vav. Beis middle letter is Yud. Total of those four letters, Yud Vav, is Lamed Beis, Leiv. Showing that Yaakov Avinu is this Leiv, is this Tzadik Emes, and so too others who are in that Bechina. As Zaydi Kodesh says that Yaakov Avinu was called the Vav himself, Zaydampin. Moshe Rabbeinu still more so, and so too all those in that category of the Leiv, which means those who are in the category of Bechinas Moshe Rabbeinu, like Rabbeinu Zohar, for example, or the Vav, the Shem, that tzaddik knows the case. This Aharon was very happy to discuss with them. And then he said that as long as they were speaking Divrei Torah, he told them two statements by Rabbeinu Zohar. One, the revelation about the Mishum and Arizal. Arizal said, quoted the posek, Torah will never be forgotten because Kilashi Shachach mi Pizadai. And this posek, proving that Torah will be forgotten, the last letters of that posek is the word Yechoi, which shows that in this posek is hidden a fact about the Mishum and Arizal. This was a very big revelation by the Arizal, which is found on the entrance to the Mishum and Arizal Siyam. Second item he told him was, Arizal reveals about the fact that Teshuva is possible through the saying of Tehillim. The Elah Shmois B'nai Yisrael Aboy Mitzayna, this Yaakov Isha Beis Ebov. The last letters of those, that pasuk, are the words Tehillim Teshuva. This Aharon spoke about in detail. And these two items, Aharon said afterwards that he was very thrilled. He came to a city like Istanbul, and there, to have the zechus of speaking Divrei Torah of Rabbeinu Zal, selling Sforim of Rabbeinu Zal, that was certainly worth all the effort and all the sacrifice and all the yisurim he had to have that zechiyah to spread the word and Sforim of Rabbeinu Zal. Now, following that, he wanted to begin the next part of the journey. He had to have his visa leaving Istanbul, leaving Turkey, confirmed by a consulate. Aharon writes about the tremendous amount of yisurim he had, the suffering he went through. Numerous times he went to the consul, and how he was accused at times of being a spy there. That's common today too. Accusations of being a spy. Of course, then it was much more dangerous. At that time, a spy could be physically hurt. He poured out a lot of tefillos, mountains of tefillos, rivers of tears before Hashem, until he was zocher to get the visa to be able to be permitted to leave Istanbul. And so he bought tickets for the ship to Alexandria. The next leg was from Istanbul to Alexandria in Egypt, and from there to Eretz Yisrael. There was an agent, a Jew, who sold him this ticket. He said he had acquired a place for him on a boat, and he wanted for this the price 300 Turkish thalers, which is a very large sum of money. Rosenfeld did not have this sum of money, but he gave him a deposit. He went about with the worry, deep concern how to raise this money. A lot of effort, a lot of heartache, he finally sold enough for him to cover this sum. But then this agent, who was sounded like a good person, good Jew, pretended to be a very close friend of Aharon, told him that the time had come that he must pay the entire amount because the boat is leaving very shortly. Other people warned Aharon, this person is a faker. He's a liar. Aharon was afraid to accuse him of this because he'd lose his last chance. He might lose his last chance to get a ticket. Secondly, he was told by some people that there's a better way to get to Eretz Yisrael, because there are two boats leaving. This one leaving to Alexandria, the second one leaving in 2 weeks to Beirut, Lebanon. And from Beirut to Israel is much closer than from Alexandria to Israel. So it would pay to go through the ship to Beirut, which costs much less than the other one. This was a dilemma. Rav Nosson had to think very deeply about this problem, which one to take. And of course, it's a very painful item when you must make a decision between two items. Rav Nosson thought about it very much and decided that the key should always be speed, to get to Eretz Yisrael faster. So it would pay to take the ship to Alexandria, which is leaving right away, no matter what happens afterwards, no matter what the consequences. At least he's doing his best to get to Eretz Yisrael, though it costs more. So he sold the rest of this for them. He said he raised the money for this trip, and the next day the agent came and told him that he collected the money. He came money on the third day and said to him, it seems the ship has left. Nosson ran to the port. He couldn't find his ship, and he ran from port to port, different port cities. It's difficult to say how you can run from one to the other, but it took hours. It was very exhausting, until finally, through a long series of searches, he finally found the ship had moved to a different section. It was still there. So he got his chaver to get their things together, and they placed everything on board the ship. They entered the ship. They were there. It was Tuesday. They were there, and this agent said the ship was leaving immediately. They were there the entire day Wednesday, and on Thursday too, the ship did not budge. Thursday was like Weimar. Rav Nosson was now very deeply worried, because he had just recently heard a story about a certain tzadik named Ableib Ashkenazi, who had been here too recently in Istanbul, and he had been sold a ticket to Eretz Yisrael aboard a ship. He paid the entire price. He entered the ship, went down into the hull of the ship, stateroom. This was a tzaddik who spent most of the time in the study of Torah, and he slept very little. So he stayed below in this stateroom and kept on studying Torah, waiting for the ship to leave. After a few days, he inquired a captain. The captain brushed him off and said, there's still time. This went on from day to day, from week to week, until he was there for 6 months' time. In the 6 months, he finally realized that he had been fooled. He walked out of the ship. He came to this agent who sold a ticket to him and said to him, for what you did to me, the Tsar, the Yisurim I had, I forgive you for everything. But I do not forgive you for the bittul Torah you caused me, because I could not learn as well there as I would have if I was home. For this I do not forgive you. For this I am certain that Hashem will repay you. This man, this agent, had a wife and 2 daughters, and very quickly, one by one, the entire family died, wiped out completely. Now, there was a certain chassid in that city who told Rav Nosson this story. Nosson was afraid that he was now a victim of this same fraud. However, he was in doubt about that too, because the person who told him the story was the chassid in that city, who himself was a ticket agent. He told this story to frighten him off from other agents, saying he was the only honest one. So he couldn't tell whom he could believe when you're dealing with this breed, this Turkish breed. However, the next day, the boat started to move, and a heavy wind came up, a heavy storm wind. He found himself with in a predicament that they weren't used to. The storm became so intensified that the Bnei Eliezer walked out on the deck and saw that the boat was tipping over, where the top of the sails were practically touching the water. The boat was just about on its side. He was afraid it would capsize. He began to call out to Rosenfeld, called down to the stateroom to help, to do the spell, to tear the heavens apart, save us from drowning. Rosenfeld wasn't frightened. They said it's very common that ships meet this kind of conditions in the stormy waters. A day or two passed by, and the storm was not abated. Kept on getting stronger and stronger, and finally, Rosenfeld saw that they were in danger. It was followed very much, and at times the boat had to stop. They would lower the anchor and let the winds just strike at the ship itself without moving it, till the winds quieted down. They'd move for a while, stop again. He did this for a long time, until they came to, they were traveling close to the shore, which means they were always in danger of striking a reef. So this is one danger on top of the other. They finally came past an island, Turkish island, and the Turkish authorities boarded the ship, asked for the credentials, the visas of the passengers. Again, the vessel was afraid that they might take away his visa or they might do him harm, and he had to reply to them in sign language. He couldn't understand them. Until finally, after a long period of questioning, they finally decided to stamp his visa, approve it, that they could go further. One of the officials reached out with his hand to shake Rosenfeld's hand, and he said to him, "Shalom, Yaakov halach l'darkon." This was a favorite Sephardic expression, wishing a Jew a good journey. Yaakov halach l'darkon, Yaakov went on his way in peace. Rosenfeld was very happy. He says he felt a deep affection for this person who gave him such a chassidus, encouragement. So they continued on. On the fourth day, they began to travel regularly, and again this tremendous storm came up. They were practically used to it, but sometime during the day, that Yid Eliezer went out on board the ship on the deck to get some water for wash, for the purpose of washing. As he stood by the edge of the boat, one of the sailors, in a very playful mood, threw a rope over his head to lasso him for a joke. As he did this, Yid Eliezer's hat fell into the sea, and it could not be retrieved. It was lost permanently. This was very painful because, for those who know what the kova elyon means, the hat, not the yarmulke, but the hat, how important it is for a religious Jew. Today, we are under the impression that if a Jew wears a yarmulke, he's a tzadik. In fact, the tzadik emes or higher, whatever goes high after that. Chassid, neither, he wears a yarmulke at all times. Imagine he has his head covered. As the Gemara says, one of the Aharon, my condition, said that he never went 4 amas without having his head covered, because Shechina is above a person, and by keeping his head covered is a symbol of showing he believes that there is a power above him. This is a sign of Amunah. Therefore, it is accepted. Even the Gemara brings that if you see a person without a hat, with his head uncovered, it is a sign that this person does not have faith. So this, especially here, we mentioned many times, very important item, that if a person goes without a hat, meaning without a yarmulke, with his head bare, then though this is not one of the Taryag mitzvahs, it's not one of the mitzvahs d'oraisa. In fact, it could not even be classified as mitzvah d'rabbanan. It would be considered as a very minor law, yet as minor as it is more important than most of the major ones. Because if a person goes with his head bared, the Gemara says that we are practically certain that this person is a complete avarian. He is a cow who cannot be trusted with any mitzvah at all. Surely he breaks all the mitzvahs of the Torah because he shows his lack of faith. The Gemara brings stories to substantiate this. At the same time, though this mitzvah is so important, the person who does keep his head covered, he does wear a yarmulke, it is still not the true sign of kavod l'shamayim, giving respect to heaven. Because there are two other items. In the first place, just as important, certainly, is the negative law. As important as it is to have a yarmulke, to have your head covered, so important it is not to have your head covered with an abundance of hair. Too much hair on a person's head is just as bad as no head, no hat at all. And this, we've stated many times, too much hair is a sign of callous, is a sign of disregard for the major mitzvahs of the Torah, and it's a sign that a person considers the so-called style of the Goyim superior to the kedusha, the holiness of the words of Hashem in the Torah. And so profane an act is this, that Arizal says it is the place, it is the invitation for shedim, for ruchais tmeyes. A person who has long hair invites evil spirits to become dwellers, to dwell within that person and upon that person. It also blocks the mentality of a person, the kedusha. Arizal brings that the sadais, sayor, is the same as sha'ar. The gates to the mind are blocked by this sayor, too much hair. In addition to a multitude of other laws, like the chatzitza, the separation. The tefillin is supposed to touch the head, not supposed to touch the hair. So a small amount of hair, normal amount, is not considered a separation of chatzitza. But an overdose of an amount, too much hair, is definitely a chatzitza between the tefillin and the head. So a person who wants to combine, to attach himself to faith in Hashem, and putting tefillin on his head, is causing this obstacle, this separation, this barrier between himself and true Emunah. That's why we mention again and again the different stories in the Gemara and the Zohar Kodesh about the tumah, the true tumah, beruchnius of hair. Something a person should avoid absolutely. On the other hand, too, as we said, having the head covered, the sign of Emunah, the sign of belief in the Shekhinah above, it is not just the yarmulke alone. This is a sign of belief, but there's also a din of kavod shemayim. We find in many cases where it comes to a closeness to Hashem. How does a person get close to Hashem? Through tefillah, Torah. A person who davens to Hashem, speaks to Hashem, must give respect to Hashem. And that means that when he goes to daven, especially when he goes to say a tefillah which is midaraisa, which means the birkas hamazon, benching, and the din says very clearly, absolutely, he should put on not the yarmulke because he's wearing it. He should yalbish his kaiva ha'elyon. He should put on the top hat, the hat that goes on top of the yarmulke, as a sign of kavod shemayim when you're about to speak to Hashem in a bracha that is midaraisa. Same thing too with davening tefillah. So that if a person is not married, he does not have a talus to put on, then he should, at the time of Shemon Esrei, which is Keneged Elam Hatzilus, he goes into above the throne of Hashem. At that time, at least, he should show his Yiras Shemayim, the fear and awe for Hashem, by putting on a hat over the yarmulke and davening Shemon Esrei at least. And of course, for Mincha and Maariv, everyone has to have a hat at the time of Shemon Esrei. For the morning tefillah, the Arizal brings the shaila, it's a side item, the shaila about, since the head must be covered, then it is incumbent, compulsory for a Jew to have the talus over his head. However, there's also a shaila, since we have the posek says, the tefillin shayad should be covered. A person should always cover the tefillin shayad, keep it covered completely, but the tefillin shalosh are tefillin that should be seen. But people should see, and they should fear Hashem by seeing you wearing tefillin. Which means the tefillin should not be covered. Therefore, the shaila is whether you're allowed to put the talus over the tefillin. This is a shaila din. There are different days in this, of course, because if the talus is over the tefillin, you can still see the outline of the tefillin according to some. So it is best when the person, the Maisa, the Yitzhak most of the days, person when placing a talus over his head, which he must do, he should cover only half of the tefillin sholosh. that he's covering actually both days. Put it over the tefillin, but still have it show out a bit. So, in any event, this all proves that there is a mitzvah of covering one's head properly when coming before Hashem. This is the reason for the wearing of a hat over the yarmulke. But once more to stress the point that without a yarmulke, a person who goes with his head completely bare, there is very little excuse for it. Now, among these Sephardim, we cannot condemn them, chas v'shalom, because there are certain days that do say a person is required to wear a hat only when he is saying a davar shebekdusha, only when he's eating. Days, of course, which we do not follow. The days, of course, which are not really mentioned halach l'meisa. The trouble with that is that these Sephardim who follow those days, practically all cases, this leads them to a greater degree of callous. They do that, they fall still further and don't wear a hat during the time of eating either. So that it's a mitzvah to be mefarsim, to get these Sephardim not to differentiate between the chacham and the tam, between a regular layman and a rabbi. The chachamim of the Sephardim always have their head covered, but only just if they would spread this word to their followers, that every Jew is alike. All Jews are born the same. There are no special requirements for a rabbi that a regular person is excused from. Both rabbi and layman should keep their head covered, even if they are special privileged citizens like Sephardim. They should have their head covered at all times. This is, of course, for the sake of the Sephardim present, this is not said as criticism. It is said as a gift. It's a gift of advice that is priceless. Priceless because if you follow this advice, you'll definitely be misaka. You'll perfect a part of the neshama that deals with the head. And we know that according to the Sfidas, the 10 Sfidas are divided into two sections. You have the Gimel Elyonim, the 3 upper ones, the Zayin Tachtonim, the 7 lower ones. The 7 lower ones are from the throat down. The 3 upper ones are the part that deal with the brain. And this is the part which is connected to the covering of the head, and therefore it is certainly a matter of more than just respect to have the symbol of faith over these 3 upper sfidas, 3 top sfidas. So we say again, ashrei to those Jews who are mekayim this mitzvah b'shleimus, which means that they never go with their head uncovered. In their whole lifetime they have their head covered as a sign, a true sign of faith. In fact, it is even advisable that a person should fulfill this mitzvah with extra credit while he is asleep. When you go to sleep at night, you wear a yarmulke, though there are some people who toss about in their sleep, and the yarmulke would fall off. You don't need a band to tie it under your chin. For a regular yarmulke, when you go to sleep, and if it falls off while you're asleep, that's an inus. You receive credit for having worn it the entire night, though it might have fallen off 5 minutes after you fell asleep. Because you started properly, you get the schar for it. This means then that while you're asleep, you're way off in dreamland, and you're doing nothing at all, yet the entire time that you're asleep, you're accomplishing a mitzvah, an action, the mitzvah of wearing a yarmulke. That's why that mitzvah is so precious. The whole night is spent by doing a mitzvah which is so important, giving kavod to Hashem and showing emunah even while you're asleep. This is again a precious bit of advice. And again, ashrei to the person who fulfills this mitzvah properly. Now back to the story with the Arizal. As we said, that the Eliezer lost his hat, came back very sadly. That day, that evening, one of these sailors got a toothache. This would have meant nothing except that he came into the Arizal's room there to use a special type of medication. He lit a fire and took some sugar. He heated the sugar to place the juice from the sugar on his tooth to abate the pain. Rosenfeld sat there petrified because he knew that the fire was very dangerous. If that fire goes out of control, he was warned by the captain time and again about lighting candles before Shabbos because it's extremely dangerous. A fire on board could destroy the ship. There was no way out. So this was a sailor he was afraid to start up with. He was afraid to go to sleep, but he couldn't stay up that late, so he fell asleep together with his chaver. Middle of the night, he sensed something. He woke up suddenly, he saw the place was in flames. The flames were in a position where he could not escape. There was no way to the door. The window of the stateroom was too tiny to get out from, and they were trapped. This could, chas v'sholom, be the end. They had some water with them. Fortunately, a Jew always has negelwasser by the bed. They took this water and poured it on the fire. We were crying out at the same time, and the other sailors came and they completed the extinguishing this fire. This was a very narrow escape. Rosenfeld writes that how wonderful the tefillah is on the sechash v'choyev, how the miracles that Hashem does to a Jew every single day. He spoke to his chaver and he said, now we can truly say that on this trip we came into both dangers. The posek says, Bonu va'eshu v'mayim. We came through fire and water, serving Hashem on the way to Eretz Yisrael. What's more, the Rosenfeld said, let's say a word from the Arizal. Arizal says, Taita Chaf. Very fitting, because Taita deals with the trip to Eretz Yisrael. The person who goes to Eretz Yisrael is a Gibar Takif, powerful person who perfects his neshama. And that Taita, the Arizal speaks about the tzadik who wants to say Divrei Taita. In order to say Divrei Taita, he must acquire the words of fire, because Divrei Taita Haveka Dvorei Ka'esh No Hashem. Hashem says, my words in the Taita are Ka'esh, they are fire. His words must be K'gachlei Esh, like coals of fire. Only then can he say these Divrei Taita. Otherwise, there's no life to them. How does a tzadik, how does a Talmud Chacham get these words of fire? Menachem says, by pouring out his heart, crying out to the Leiv Ha'elyon. There's a heavenly heart, a heart in heaven, Kaviyachol, and from this heart he can get the necessary words. This Leiv Ha'elyon is called Tzur Levavi. The Tzur means the rock from above. This rock, symbolically, was the rock that Moshe Rabbeinu struck to get water. As you know, the water means the words of Taita. The words of Taita came from this rock. We once went to this whole point about striking the rock, the water that came out slowly, the difficulties in understanding Taita because of the fact that water does not flow so quickly. But from this rock came forth the waters, and these are the waters that a person drinks to get Taita from. So, therefore, the Talmud Chacham, the Tzaddik who wants to speak, to deliver these fiery words of Taita, must apply to this heavenly rock. How? By pouring out his heart. He pour out his own heart with tears, tefillos, and thereby warming up the Leiv Ha'elyon, the heavenly heart, and receive from there these waters of Taita. Which means then that this is part of the Gibar Takif, part of the act of a person going to Eretz Yisrael. He must acquire this point first. Which means that he must go through the combination of fire and water, to get the water from this rock to be able to speak these words of Taita. Rosenfeld said that how wonderful it is that we were zecher now to go through this, to be able to realize this in action, and to go through this frightening experience. The storm we went through with the water, and now the experience with the danger of the perils of this fire in the middle of the night, but at the same time it is a sign that we are on the right track in this journey. Especially, too, the Rosenfeld said that he calmed himself. He was very upset, but he calmed himself with the fact that he was zecher that this brought about the opportunity to speak words of Taita from the Arizal Sefer. They continued on, and on the fifth day, the Rosenfeld said that the storm became so heavy that he feared now the inevitable. this was that he became very, very seasick. Together with Eliezer, he became very seasick, and they lay down, and they could not get up anymore. They began to regurgitate, and if they tried to eat or drink anything, it was impossible to retain it. And as time went by, it became much worse, until they could not eat anything at all. They couldn't move to get out of their beds. And this went on for hour after hour, for days, went past the Shabbos, until the following Wednesday. By Wednesday, they finally were able to get out of bed, to eat something, and drink something, and to retain the food. Again, they gave thanks to Hashem, thanks to Hashem, they could return back to normalcy in fair health. On Thursday, they finally arrived at the city of Alexandria. They got there, they were very happy to finally have got to this place. Of course, now they were faced with new types of adventures. They had gone through the Turks. Now they came to the Arabs in Egypt. Of course, as we know, we spoke about the fact that Avraham had to go through, he was told first go to Mitzrayim, and then go to Eretz Yisrael. Rosenfeld felt that this was the Yerida, the Tzedek Aliyah. We explained that Zaydik Kodesh says that there is a klipa that comes before the Pnei. You cannot eat a fruit without first having to remove the outer rind, the outer shell. Because the Pnei, the fruit, is covered by this klipa, by the tumor. Remove that, and you'll find the inside is pure. For the same reason, Hashem knew that the Jews had to go to Mitzrayim first. They could not remain in Eretz Yisrael. They could not go right to the mountain side of Eretz Yisrael. They had to go down to the lowest depth of tumor. Mitzrayim is Min HaMeitzah, the most constricting place in the world, filled with the deepest tumor in existence. You go down that low, and from there they could then rise up and come to the highest Aliyah, the highest Kedusha. This, what Moshe felt now, was part of his mission. He got to Alexandria after going to Istanbul. He came down to the Arabs, to the darker Arabs in Mitzrayim. That's part of the descendants of Ham, who were a different color than normal. And dealing with these Arabs now, he had to try to find the Jews who lived there. Again, he would have difficulty with the communications. Moshe, though, was very happy he got this far, and he told his chavruta to remain on board. He would go out and make contact with the Jews there, at least first try to find the chacham in that city, and then to continue on to raise further funds and continue the last leg of their journey. He went out with the captain, entered into the city of Alexandria for the first time, and unusual sights met his eyes. How he got to a place of lodging, the adventures that they experienced in the city of Alexandria, will take up in the next Shir. Meanwhile, we note that despite all the difficulties, Hashem helps those who are so optimistic, so sincere in their desires to get to their goal. And therefore, again, this is a lesson to every one of us today, which more so, these great tzaddikim mitiyim opened the gates for us. And they went through all this suffering, made it more simple for us to realize the culmination, the fulfillment of a mission like this. It is the duty of every single Jew to complete his neshama by coming to Eretz Yisrael, going there for the proper kavuna, to perfect himself spiritually. The person who makes the attempt with true tzivis and emunah will certainly succeed. Let's hope that we're all together to go to Eretz Yisrael now with the coming of Mashiach. You should see the Binyan Beis Mikdash from Heda. Amen. Amen.